I often have conversations with people who are beginning to read the Bible for the first time. Now, sometimes they come in to talk to me after they've been reading along for a little while, and they have, how shall I put it, questions. And sometimes they come in to talk to me before they've even embarked on this journey, and they're seeking guidance and counsel to get them ready. Either way, the crux of these conversations is usually the same. We talk about the difference between what we think is going to be in the Bible versus what actually is in the Bible. You see, a lot of folks come to the Bible with a rule book or an operator's manual kind of a mindset. They expect the Bible to be filled with an abundance of clear guidance for how they should live their lives and what they should do in all of life's various specific circumstances. There's even a kind of acronym for this approach to reading the Bible, which I promise I didn't make up, but I'll share with you. BIBLE, Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. This way of thinking isn't exactly wrong, but it is not entirely right either. The Bible is certainly holy, but it is not basic. And it is quite applicable, but it is also easily taken out of context and misunderstood. And while we should most definitely all be reading the Bible, meditating on it on our own, the Bible is not so much written for individuals as it is written for a community, for the whole people of God. Which is to say that the Bible is much more for and about us than it is for or about me. I hope that makes sense. Because this is really important to understand when we open any part of the Bible. Really, I can't think of any part that wouldn't apply, but most especially when we crack open the prophets, which of course we're reading through this summer. The prophets are God's messengers of judgment and hope, then and now. But what they have to say can very easily go sailing right over our heads if we don't understand, first of all, that they're not so much offering personal, private, spiritual advice to individuals as they are telling us on behalf of God how we ought to be living as a whole society. All right, there's some setup then, all right? And this is very true for Amos, who, if you were around last week, you got an introductory dose, and then we got more of it today. I'll say my Addie was supposed to be the lector, and I'm not ungrateful that she is out of town and couldn't read, and I had to ask Adam to read it instead, because that was a doozy, wasn't it? Last week, too. Let me tell you a little bit about Amos. It's hard to imagine a more unlikely prophet. He's from this tiny little village called Tekoa, which is not really all that far from Bethlehem, which means not really all that far from Jerusalem, up in the Judean high country, in the mountains. He was a herdsman and an arborist, which I love. Which is to say, and by the way, Tekoa is this tiny little village, 150 people. This is not an educated man or a leader or anyone important by typical human standards. It's a reminder, one more, that God does like to choose the so-called unimportant for some of the most important tasks. If you ever feel yourself to be unimportant, look out. Amos is from, as I said, this little village near Bethlehem, which means he's from the southern kingdom of Judah. And you know, Ted and Rebecca and I have been harping on this a little bit. It's just important to understand that there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Saul, David, Solomon, it was all unified, one big kingdom. But then after Solomon, it broke in two, north and south. The southern kingdom is called Judah. It includes Jerusalem and the temple. The northern kingdom is called, somewhat confusingly, Israel. Different kingdoms. And they're related, sisters even, but rivals. So a prophet from down south coming up north with a message of judgment. Well, you can imagine how well that went over. Tradition says he doesn't make it out alive. It's hard enough to listen to someone on your own team point out all of your flaws and your failures, let alone have to listen to somebody on your rival team point those things out. We hate that. And yet, this does seem to be something that God routinely does throughout the ages. Speak the hardest truths through unexpected mouths. God does not always speak with gentleness and affirmation through comfortable and convenient messengers. Frankly, one of the best ways to tell the difference between the true and living God and a dead and false God is that a false God will never surprise you and will never tell you anything you don't like. If you only ever hear what you like, I'm not sure that's God you're listening to. The northern kingdom of Israel was close to several of its adjacent rivals. The Philistines, the Arameans, the Syrians, and the Assyrians. Who, I don't know if you were like me, but in high school, like global history, I remember being taught that the Assyrians were the meanest, baddest bunch of bloodthirsty warriors in the ancient world. They were like the worst. A few years before Amos shows up on the scene, the Assyrians had conquered Damascus, which was the capital of a little rival state to the north. It was their overthrow. And when that happened, the Israelites, they threw a party. They were so happy about the destruction of their detested neighbors that they didn't pause to consider for a moment that the Assyrians were unlikely to stop there. All of that really raw language in today's reading about dead bodies and disaster, that was Amos foretelling what the Assyrians were about to mete out on Israel. It happens a couple of decades later, and Israel is obliterated from the face of the earth. Doesn't exist again. In geopolitics, as in personal relationships, hatred and petty jealousy, it really does make us dumb, doesn't it? All right, one last little bit of context for old Amos here. The 8th century BCE, it's the time in which he is prophesying. It was a time of have and have-nots. It was the best of times and the worst of times. Archaeologists have explored and uncovered evidence from that era of the tremendous opulence of the very richest members of that society. Archaeologists have also discovered signs that the number of slaves and day laborers multiplied dramatically in that century. Trade and business was booming, but only a small percentage of the population was enjoying all that prosperity. That is to say, the rich were getting a whole lot richer, and almost everyone else was stuck in poverty. This is what Amos saw when he arrived. And this is what he had in mind when he pronounced the words that we heard today to the king and his court and all his priests. You are like summer fruit. Everything seems beautiful and sumptuous today, but the rot is already setting in. And you think that the good times will never fade, but the flies will soon be circling. And you think because your lives are easy and content right now that God is very happy with you, but what you're doing is fooling yourselves, and terrible will be your fall. All right. I hope it helps to know a little bit of this context. But what does any of this have to do with us? This is all particular to a long ago and far away kingdom, right? God didn't like what they were doing, so God sent this prophet Amos to go tell them what's what. Well, so what for us? Well, anytime a society abandons the vulnerable and treats some lives as though they matter less than others, Amos is still speaking. Anytime the scales of justice are tipped in favor of the powerful, Amos is still speaking. Anytime the needs of the poor are sacrificed to satisfy the whims of the rich, Amos is still speaking. Anytime neglect of the needy becomes a source of pride for those in power, Amos is still speaking. Anytime greed is glorified and cruelty becomes commonplace, Amos is still speaking. Which means, by my reckoning, that Amos is still very much speaking across the ages to this very day, and his words continue to ring out with the judgment of God. Quite often today, when people talk about the moral decline of America, what they have in mind are personal behaviors by other people that they don't like. If Amos was standing here today, he would agree that there is a moral decline. But he'd worry less about the moral behaviors in other individuals, and he would be more interested in pointing out the 40 million people in our country who live in poverty, including 10 million children. He would have in mind the 14 million children who regularly go to bed hungry every day in our country of abundance. He would point to the rapidly widening income inequality in which the richest 10% in our country own 70% of the wealth, and the poorest 50% of our country own 3% of the wealth. And Amos would definitely have something to say about our government's decision to shift trillions of dollars toward the wealthiest of our society while simultaneously eliminating programs that feed, educate, and offer health care to the very poorest among us. We don't have to imagine what Amos would say, because what he said long ago still echoes to today. You are like summer fruit. You appear sweet and full of promise, but I can already smell the decay. And you seem so lovely now, but tomorrow you'll be attracting flies. On the drive back from Colorado this last week, I kept noticing, I did a lot of the driving, and you know how you slow down when you see the cop cars, and I did that too. I kept noticing how, I don't know why I'd never noticed it quite this way before, how so many law enforcement cars in municipalities, counties, whatever, have the words "In God We Trust" printed on the side. And I was curious about that, as though recognizing it for the first time, about when did that start happening. And so I looked it up, and it turns out, and you probably already know this, that "In God We Trust" was officially ratified as our country's motto in 1956, Cold War era. Replacing what? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. In God we trust. I wonder if we know what we're saying when we say as a nation, "In God we trust." Do we trust God to protect and defend us no matter what we do? Do we trust God to always be on our side, regardless of how we treat people? If we're listening to the witness of the prophets, and especially if we're listening to Amos, we might be more cautious about boldly proclaiming our trust in God. Because we can trust that God is paying attention to how we are treating the poor. And we can trust that God is aware of the greed of our economic policy and the cruelty of our big, beautiful abandonment of the needy. We can trust that God recognizes the idols our country has made out of wealth and power. True trust in God means listening for God's voice, and not only when we are being complimented, but also when God is calling us out and correcting us. So yes, let's really actually put our trust in God. But not in some abstract idea of God, not in the mascot God that politicians like to trot out at the end of speeches. Let's put our trust in the God we meet in Christ Jesus. For as Paul writes to the Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God. He is the firstborn of all creation. In him all things are held together, for in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. So let's keep looking for him and listening to him and patterning our lives after him. And let's care about who he cares about. And let's have mercy on those he has mercy on. And let's love the ones he loves. You see, that's our answer to Amos. That's our response always to the sin and evil of the world. That's always our mission and our purpose. That's how, to quote another oracle from Amos, justice will at last roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.